Welcome to the Illuminating Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Marcia Narayan Weldon, and I'm a lawyer, business strategist, corporate trainer, and executive coach. Each week, I'm going to bring you my favorite entrepreneurs, thought leaders, legal professionals, and other coaches who will inspire, educate, and empower you. Unlock the secrets to mastering negotiations in business, love, and across cultures with our special guest, Cindy Watson. She's a remarkable lawyer, coach, podcaster, and Wall Street Journal best-selling author of The Art of Feminine Negotiation and Practicing with Purpose. Delve into the 7 deadly sins of negotiation and learn the art of balancing multiple projects without burning out. Transform your daily interactions with expert tips from a seasoned negotiator. So tune in and become a negotiation pro in all aspects of your life. Today we have someone super special, Cindy Watson, who is a lawyer, a podcaster, a best-selling author, a coach. She does everything. And she is the author of The Art of Feminine Negotiation, which is also the name of her podcast. She's also the author of Practicing with Purpose, which we'll talk about in a little while, and so many other things as well. So my first question before we get started into negotiation, which everybody needs to know, whether you're a lawyer, a parent, anything, how do you do all of this? How do you manage to take care of all of this, still look like you're perfectly sane, because we hear so much about stress and burnout? How do you manage this?
Well, you're a great model for that, frankly.
I don't know about all that. I don't know about all that.
But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think one of the keys to being able to juggle more things is take on projects that you're really passionate about. I think so often in life, women do what's expected of us, and we follow these paths in life that leave us feeling a little dissatisfied, that niggling dissatisfaction, right? So I sort of made a commitment to myself that I was going to be spending this, 1,442 minutes a day that we all are given on this earth, doing things that I really care about, that I'm passionate about. And that, I think, keeps you more on task, on focus, because you're not grudging the work, if you will.
Well, great. Now, do you have a morning or an evening routine or something that is non-negotiable, no matter how tired you are, you're going to do it? Or do you just go day by day and it is?
Myself that I was going to be spending this, 1,442 minutes a day that we all are given on this earth, doing things that I really care about, that I'm passionate about. And that, I think, keeps you more on task, on focus, because you're not grudging the work, if you will.
Well, great. Now, do you have a morning or an evening routine or something that is non-negotiable, no matter how tired you are, you're going to do it? Or do you just go day by day and it is what it is?
I used to definitely be a day by dayer, and I have gotten so much more intentional about that, both for myself and for my clients. One of the non-negotiables that I have is to create what I call a brag list, where you write down all of the qualities that you can appreciate about yourself, the tangible, the intangible, just, things that nice things people have said about you, nice things people should have said about you.
Right.
And reading that every evening just before you're going to bed, when your subconscious is a little bit open, and adding to it every day, because we tend to beat ourselves up a lot, I think, as women in particular. But generally, I think as humans, we have that inner critic constantly talking to us. So it just helps to reground and remind ourselves, so my brain can percolate all evening, and it forces me to think about those things that day that I was proud of, that I achieved, that I discovered about myself. So I love that as a non-negotiable at night. And in the morning, I believe that negotiating our mindset is our first and most important negotiation. So I always look out the window and just take it in and go, today is going to be a fantastic day. Just reprogramming that brain.
It's so important, the power of words, right? People don't realize you might go to sleep listening to the news at night. That's what's going in your head.
Oh.
That's why you're waking up anxious. And that's why I don't watch the news. I mean, I read about the news, but I don't watch the news. But I used to fall asleep watching the news all the time. I'd wake up in the morning like, I feel like I'm psychic. I think there was an earthquake in Turkey. It's like, oh, that was because the news is on all night long in my head. So why not fill our heads with something that actually is good about us, and to reprogram the brain, like you said? I love it.
Oh,
now, I hear your accent. You're from Canada. So people in the U.S.
I don't hear
it. I think people in the U.S. think people from Canada are more polite and just more gentle. We could be wrong. But are there cultural differences when it comes to negotiation?
Generally, or do you mean between Canada and the U.S.?
Just generally, we're not trying to get into CAFTA and NAFTA
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. So,
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the things that people most often overlook is be sensitive to cultural differences, because even, you mentioned Canada and US, we are so close in so many ways and share so many things, but there are definitely some cultural differences. And I've seen countless deals blow up when people are dealing with a culture that they're not familiar with, didn't bother taking the time to get familiar with, and end up engaging in some major faux pas that sets the negotiation off track, and they just cannot get things back on track because they don't know what they did wrong. So absolutely, culture plays a great role. And I think as part of your preparation process, consider that as a factor that you need to be looking into.
so where are some reputable sources to get information about culture and negotiation? Because I don't want podcast listeners saying, I'm just going to go watch a TikTok video and see, okay, this is what people in Canada are like, or this is what people in the US are like. Because, unfortunately, TikTok
Yeah,
is a huge search engine for people
yeah.
now, especially for younger people, and the information is not always accurate. Of course, your TikTok videos are accurate and my
Yeah.
TikTok videos are
Oh, thank
accurate,
you.
but we can't speak for everybody else.
Yeah.
So, how do you know that you're getting legitimate information without actually being offensive? Because you
Oh,
could go into another country or even another part
absolutely.
of your own country and think that you've learned all this stuff, you're culturally competent, you start using words and expressions, and then you go the complete opposite direction. You're almost being offensive in your
Yeah.
effort to be culturally appropriate.
Oh, I love that. And I think it is a fine line to navigate, because you could go doing all this research about cultural appropriateness and show up with somebody who doesn't follow that particular aspect of the culture. And I find it very offensive, and that you're stereotyping and trying to pigeonhole them. So it can really backfire. So two things. One part of your question is, where do you find reputable sources? And we live in an era now where it's almost dangerous because there is so much information available,
Mm-hmm.
and it's tough to distinguish the chaff from the wheat, right? What is valuable or not. So I always encourage people, like, by all means, use online resources, but stay away from, frankly, from your TikTok or your Insta stories or things like that. Go to reputable sources. Try and find some source documents, if you can, where there have been actual, authentic papers written by people with some type of authority behind them, and just try and get some of those tidbits. But the other piece of it that I would really mention is, don't be afraid to ask. Like, when in doubt, it is such a valuable resource to be able to just say, I want to make sure right out of the gate, that I don't offend in any way. Are there any sort of cultural sensitivities that I should be aware of? And, I believe we all need to grow and advance. And I hope you don't mind me asking, right? I think better that than make assumptions that turn out to backfire.
And that's really important. And when I used to travel a lot, I still travel a lot for work, but when in the earlier days, I would read things like Kiss, Bow, and Shake Hands, or those other kinds of books. And I would realize, oh, if I put the chopsticks in this way, that might mean something completely different. So we have to think about these things. And so some listeners might be saying, well, I don't negotiate for business. Do I need to listen to this? I believe we negotiate every day. You negotiate with your kids
Oh,
to brush their teeth. You negotiate with AT&T to not to take off that charge that was actually you incurred, but you don't want to pay it,
yeah.
and all kinds of things. So, why do people need to know about negotiation? And what are the biggest mistakes that non lawyers make about negotiation?
Oh, I think that you are singing my song. Let me tell you, because that is one of my mantras, is that all of life is a negotiation. And I think one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself is just simply recognize that. And I really, agonized over whether to even use the word, because I do get a lot of pushback. People think, oh, negotiation, I don't need it. Or negotiation, it's, boardrooms and power suits. So that's not really relevant to me because I'm not in that environment. But you are negotiating, as you said, every day with your kids, with your intimate partner, negotiating with yourself for your
Mm-hmm.
mindset, service
Mm-hmm.
providers, banks, insurance companies, and or the multi-million-dollar deal. So recognizing that these are negotiations, and that there's a form of influence and persuasion that is happening every day in a myriad of ways, just that simple recognition and bringing intention to it will help up level the skill that you bring to the table. And when you're saying what are the biggest mistakes, I call them the 7 deadly sins of negotiation. So
Mm-hmm.
ego is one, I think, and in North America in particular, I think we're very guilty of this. We make everything about me. We think of negotiations as a win-lose proposition. We see it as a competition. It's one of the things that prompted me to write The Art of Feminine Negotiation. I'm like on a mission to flip that story, to
Right.
reframe how we define success. So If you find in a negotiation that you're making it about yourself, I
Mhm.
stop, drop, and roll. Immediately get into curiosity mode and start asking questions. There is gold when you start truly seeking to understand what the other party needs. So, ego, attachment, we get too attached to one particular idea, how this needs to turn out. And I've seen people miss gorgeous opportunities for
Mhm.
better settlements than they had even hoped for if they had
Right.
just left themselves more flexible. Reactivity, we tend to get triggered. Know what your triggers are, consider what the other party's triggers are in advance. And we also in North America jump straight to business. Allow time to build rapport, frankly, get some connection, some human sort of interaction before you jump right to the nuts and bolts. And not listening. Again, North America in particular, we are not taught to listen very well. It is absolutely key. And the last one, the seventh deadly sin, I think, is not being in integrity. And by that, I mean it in both senses of the word, right? Like we
Mhm.
talk about integrity from a moral standpoint, but the actual Latin root is about being whole, being based on the integer. So when we are out of alignment with our own values or principles, then we are not going to be very effective negotiators. So those I would say are the seven deadly sins.
Okay. So you mentioned rapport, and I was lucky enough to be trained by Fisher and Uri, who wrote Getting to Yes when I was in law school, which is
Nice.
fantastic. And all we learned about rapport, and I've also done things like NLP, neuro linguistic program. You talk about rapport. There's a general layperson's term about rapport as well, but what do you mean by rapport, and how do you establish it, and why is it so important?
It is so important. And I'm glad you raised that because there are a lot of books out there, and I've got some names I will not name, but everybody will probably know what I'm talking about, where it's all now about mirror and match, mirror and match. And you've got all of these people out there so much in their head that they're thinking, okay, they've leaned forward, I need to lean forward. They've crossed their legs, I need to cross my legs. And I think it does a disservice
The
because
monkey see, don't monkey do kind of thing.
yes, because I mean to learn, yeah, can it be a valuable skill to mirror and match? Yes, but that it takes a lot of practice. It takes a certain skill to be able to do that effectively.
Right.
So I would say the first thing about building rapport is be yourself. You know, Oscar Wilde quipped, right? Be yourself, everyone else is taken. So
Right.
be authentic. That will
Mhm.
always get you further. If you don't know something, admit you don't know. Don't worry about it undermining your credibility. But try and find some, I talked about not jumping straight to business, but I see a lot of advice out there about, making small talk and talking about the weather to build rapport. I much prefer and advocate for people find some actual human connection. Try
Right.
and find some point that matters to the other person, some area where you have some overlap. And I will say on mirror and matching, rather than worried about the sort of body gestures to match, I do think it's very important to try and match the other person's tone,
Right.
pacing, volume, sort of language, things like that. Because I tend to be very sort of flamboyant and
Me
passionate
too.
sometimes. And if I'm dealing with somebody who is an introvert and or finds that off-putting, I make a point of really modulating my tone, slowing down my pace a little bit, because I'm doing myself and both of us in the negotiation a disservice if I'm just ramming through at my own pace and style and it's not landing at all with the other person. So those are some tips. And try if you can to do something outside of the negotiation first. Not always possible, but if you've got a big set of negotiations coming up, if you can make some time to meet somewhere off-site, whether it's for a breakfast or a lunch or some particular event that maybe you both have in common, go to an art show, go to a
Right.
sporting game, something where you can get that further bonding experience can go a really long way.
And that explains for people who may wonder, why do people go out for all these business dinners and why do they go to basketball games? Because you have to bond. And when you bond, it's a lot easier to have some of these kinds of conversations. Now,
Absolutely.
let's talk about personality. I think I was telling you before we came on. I also, people who are listening, they know that I'm a lawyer, law professor, coach, etc. So I have a class on negotiation and drafting contract skills. It's called something else,
Nice.
but that's what it's about.
Yeah.
And so our students recently finished the negotiation. We went through some of the debriefs, and somebody was saying, I'm a type A person. How do I get calmer? I come in, I want to go like this. I'm aggressive, right? And so often people see, I think they're so used to seeing on television what they think is the pound the table type of
Absolutely.
negotiation. So how important is personality? And can that type A person kind of sit back and calm down and modulate the tone and modulate the emotion? And vice versa, can the person who's might be a little bit more meek and laid back how do they deal with that person who's the fist pounding, my way or the highway
Yeah.
person?
Oh, great questions. So I'd say yes. I mean, certainly we do bring different personalities to the table. And I've said, be authentic. Having said that, we can all train ourselves. And one thing I want to say before we jump right in on that is I invite all of your listeners and viewers to really question themselves about whether that type A, aggressive, go get them, take no prisoners kind of approach is actually innately authentic to you, or have you been conditioned to believe that it's one of the things, as I say, that prompted me to write The Art of Feminine Negotiation and to start on this path is I recognized I was guilty of it. My clients called me the Barracuda and they meant it as a compliment. And I wore it like a badge of honor for a long time, and until I had my epiphany, because there's a high cost that comes with that. But recognizing that we have been very conditioned to see negotiations as competitive, to see that in the business world, it's the person talking the loudest and the longest who's winning. It's the person who beats their chest. And having represented trade unions, I saw loads of that over my 30 years, let me tell you. So yes, you can change. I think it's all about being intentional. And I think the most effective negotiators, they show up from an authentic place, and they're also really intentional about deciding, I call it the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why. Who do I want to be? Who do I want to show up as? Choose 3 words, 3 adjectives that actually describe how I would like the other person to see me in that negotiation. And doing that allows you to ground yourself. So if you start getting triggered or off in that type A personality, you can really ground yourself quickly. So think about that who, what you want, not just in terms of the substantive outcome, but also thinking about the relationship outcomes that you want, the process outcomes that you want.
Right.
So showing up with more intentionality around who you want to be, who they expect you to be, is a really huge game changer. And I'll share with you really quickly. When I was in law school, and it's funny when you're talking about your students, I took a negotiation course, and we were basically negotiating for our marks, which I didn't know, or I probably wouldn't have taken the course. But we were given simulated exercises, and whoever got the best settlement, based on strictly dollars and cents, not a lot of creativity room, they got the highest mark and all the way down. And I won virtually every negotiation that year. And I'm not saying that to brag, but because it wasn't, I'm embarrassed to say, until years later that I recognized back then, prior to starting the practice of law, I actually was in my authentic place. I came to every one of those negotiations, building rapport, bringing empathy to the table, being flexible, building trust, saying, we've only got 50 minutes or we get a 0. What do you need? Tell me what you want. Let's come on, getting creative. Then I started the practice of law, looked around. I'm like 20-something-year-old, fresh faced out of law school, the only woman almost always. I thought, I better get scrappier if I'm going to be taken seriously. So really check in whether that is your authentic personality type or whether you've been conditioned to believe it. And if it is, that's fine. Just recognize that that will be off-putting, and you may be doing yourself a disservice by not parking your ego and showing up from a place of, I call it the art of fascination and curiosity, right? Seeking to learn more.
So let's speak about being a woman in negotiation. You've written a book called The Art of Feminine Negotiation, a Wall Street Journal bestseller, if my understanding is correct. You also have a podcast of the same name. What does that actually mean? And are women and men different in terms of negotiation?
Oh, boy, you're hitting all the chorus here, things that I agonized over, frankly, because I really went back and forth about whether to even use the term feminine. And for a couple of reasons, frankly. I mean, one, I think as a society, we are getting away from these gender attributions, and I think that's a good thing. But the more I dug into it, I thought, you know what? Women in particular are still being more adversely impacted by the deep conditioning around be nice, play small, don't make yourself larger than life, not in feelings of not enoughness, a lot of limiting stories that put us at a disadvantage potentially as negotiators. And because so when I talk about the art of feminine negotiation, we all have masculine and feminine energy. I believe that because for so long we've been conditioned to define success on that more competitive, dare I say, more masculine model, both men and women started stifling their feminine, believing that that was the only path to success. And then we personally go out of balance and the world goes out of balance. So I was very intentional about using the term feminine even though it applies, and I think both men, I think the world will be a better place if both men and women start tapping into their feminine. And in
Wait, before
particular,
you go on,
yeah,
what does that actually mean? I think
well,
about that all the time, and I think about the
yes,
masculine, the feminine
yeah,
energies. Are going to be some people here are going to say, like, I'm all man, I have no feminine
yeah,
energy. What do
yeah,
you mean? Or I'm all women, there is no masculine energy. So
yeah.
let's unpack that a little bit
I
for
love it.
those that aren't familiar with the terms.
Yeah. And this isn't to say that these so-called feminine traits or masculine traits are exhibited more by women or men. It's just there was a study done, the Athena study, I think it was called, and there were like 60,000 people over 60 countries, and they took a whole bunch of leadership traits and
Hmm.
asked people to ascribe whether they saw those traits as more masculine, feminine,
Yes.
or neutral. So when I speak to this, I'm talking more about that sort of statistical study that would suggest that rightly or wrongly, people do attribute certain traits as being more feminine or masculine. I've met loads and loads of men who have gorgeous sort of traits that people would consider to be feminine, and vice versa. So, the kinds of things for me, the heart of the art of feminine negotiation is if you look at the 6 traits that make for the most effective negotiators, 5 out of 6 of them are traits that people would consider feminine. And that's rapport building, empathy, flexibility, intuition, and trust. So I call it the RFIT model because the 6 is assertiveness. So it's just
Mm,
AREFIT. But
love
under
it.
each of those, you have like under empathy, it's listening, it's collaboration versus competition. It's bringing compassion to the table. So really, we're talking about the traits or qualities, not the gender.
Got it. That's helpful. So, is there any time when being a woman is a superpower in negotiation? And then, what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes women are still making? I imagine one of them must be thinking they have to negotiate like men. But
Yes.
what? But when is being a woman, and I guess
Yeah.
traditionally thought of the
Yeah.
traditional term of woman versus man, how does that help, and how does that
Yeah.
hurt
Yeah.
today?
I believe, and it's sort of the thing I advocate when I go out and speak at events and for women's events in particular, but across the board, I advocate lean into that feminine. I think it's always a superpower in negotiation, frankly. I
Hmm.
think people would get better outcome. I think we would see less global conflict, frankly, let alone in the corporate world, let alone in your personal lives, if people actually brought compassion and listened more than they talked and came with curiosity and an open mind and some vulnerability thrown into the mix. I think these are all, I call them our secret weapons. So instead of seeing them as a liability, I think when we lean into our feminine emotion, people often say, oh, don't bring emotion to negotiations. That's, women are too emotional. We are emotional beings as humans. So, don't be emotional in a negotiation necessarily, but definitely bring the emotion behind what you're, it's not just about the money, it's what that money represents, for example. So when you can bring your deeper why around that, you're going to elevate your ability. So that I think the short answer to your question is if you lean into your feminine, lean into that messiness. If the other party's getting really upset, instead of us throwing our hands back, which we do, lean in. There's gold there and say, I seem to have really set you off. I know it's important to, it's important to me to treat people with dignity and respect. I want us to get back on track. Talk to me. What's happened here? Lean in because there's beautiful gold nuggets there. And I would say the biggest mistakes women are making are acting like a man for sure, or believing you have to act like a man or bring that competitive energy. But at the other end of the spectrum, it's amazing to me how often I still see women don't ask. I mean, you talk about the inequity in the workplace between salaries, but there have been a lot of studies where employers who have a discrepancy between what their males and females are getting paid, and routinely their answer is, these guys asked. The women didn't ask. So I think not asking often enough and not asking for enough are 2 of the biggest mistakes that I see women making consistently in negotiations.
And this is so true. I remember when I went from being outside counsel to in-house counsel, and I had been, negotiating significant deals and settlements and trials and all that kind of stuff. But when I got the job offer, I was like, okay. And so the general counsel said, I really questioned the fact that you were okay with the salary, that you didn't negotiate anything, that you were
That's
like
so
just
good.
ready to come on over. And I was thinking, did we make a bad hire? And it was even worse because my best friend from age 12 was the HR person, right? She says,
So funny.
she goes, I was the one that suggested you. Now I look bad because you didn't
Oh,
ask for anything. Now, partly I was just so glad to go in house. But
Yeah.
second of all, like I've never lived that down. And I think about that all the time. So when people are looking at like they're about to get the job offer,
Yeah.
what are some of the best practices? What are some of the hacks that people haven't heard before about negotiating for salary?
Oh,
Obviously, you have to be willing to ask, right? Which I did
absolutely.
not do. And now I'm much better at this, by the way. So for those of you who listen, like really, she's teaching negotiation but I say this to be vulnerable, right? Because
I
even
love it.
I, as a person who
Yeah.
was, dealing with trials and negotiating
Yeah.
settlements on behalf of, multi-billion dollar companies, like, okay, I'll come. Thank you.
Yeah.
When,
I
when can
love
I
that.
start? so,
Oh,
so
thanks for sharing and being vulnerable. And I mean, we're all guilty of it. I mean, I teach the art of negotiation at, a pretty high level. And I'll be quite candid. When we bought our current property, oh my gosh, I wanted it so badly. I was like negotiating against myself. It was outrageous. So we're all guilty of it. So I love that.
it is what it is. So when you're negotiating for salary, what should I have
Yeah.
done? We have people, and
Yeah.
again, let's also think about the fact that depending on people are listening, we're recording this in early 2023.
Yeah.
We may be going into some economic headwinds. Can
Absolutely.
people even really negotiate right now when times are economically tough and people are just happy to have a job?
Oh, so important. And yes, and I think it's one of the mistakes people often make where we buy into that. Oh my gosh, we're in a recession. We're just lucky to have a job. I saw it with my trade union clients. It was something that employers use
Mm.
routinely. There is always room for a negotiation. And part of it comes back to owning your value. And it goes back, I think, to what we were saying earlier about the brag list. When I say that's one of my non negotiable practices, when I have clients who come specifically for advice about a salary negotiation, here are some of my sort of key tips. One, create your own personal brag list so you have an absolute grounded sense of your value. Consider both the tangible things, concrete achievements that you have, but
Mhm.
also consider those intangibles. I am an amazing team player. I boost morale in my workplaces. I come up with creative initiatives. So be thinking of those concrete numbers like your sales ability, your closing ability, whatever it is for the job, your technical expertise, but have a fulsome brag list about everything you bring to the table. And having said that,
Mhm.
recognize that most employers don't necessarily care about the resume, if you will. They care about
Right.
how it impacts on their business. So really be intentional in your interview and as part of your preparation. Find out what's important. What are some of the criteria they set? What are the markers that they use? What are the things that they value as a corporation? And make sure that you're using we language, and so that
Mm.
even subconsciously you're already instilling that you're part of the team.
I'm
You're
part of the
going to be a
team, right?
valuable asset, right? So you come into that, and when you're doing your brag list, think of your past, your present skills and contributions, but also future. I think people miss this. I think it's a game changer in a salary negotiation or for a position, new hire position, when you go in and say, I'm really excited about the possibility of us doing this together. Here's some ideas I have for how we can grow this or build that. And I don't want to overstep here, but I just want to show you some of the sort of passion and creativity, how I think we could be such a great team and hit greater markers. So using that kind of inclusive we language. Also, do your homework. Know not only what this employer pays across the board in various positions where they value, but know what the competitors are playing, both within your industry, but in terms of geography and on the broader scale. And know what your alternatives are. It's one thing to go in there and be asking for the sky and the moon, but you can do that with much more confidence if you know that there are other positions that will actually be available. So know what your best alternative to this negotiated agreement is going in. But ultimately, I find if you've really done that brag list and you've done your homework to know what the parameters are, what the possible zone of potential agreement is, and get
Hmm.
creative and don't be afraid to ask, what are the criteria you're hoping to hit? And then you can tie it back and say, here's how I think I meet this, and this. And what are the values that are the most important to you? Oh, I'm so glad you said that, because here's an example of where I really
Right.
brought that to the table and have been commended. That, I think, is a game changer when you go into a negotiation. And practice in advance. If you're going to be
Mm.
asking for an ask that you're uncomfortable with, do it in front of the mirror, do it with your significant other, practice with friends, and make sure that by the time you say the number out loud and or your ask, like, I want extra vacation time, I want a better title, I want access to training, think outside the box and be ready that when you say that, it is as comfortable as water to you to be able to make those asks.
Yeah, I always think about, must-haves versus your nice-to-haves as well, because sometimes for some people, the title might be more important than certain money because you're thinking about, if I have this title externally. So
Yeah,
there are things that, and there are times that the company can give you things that don't cost anything, but you don't ask for it.
absolutely.
And I always tell people, because I've negotiated a gazillion severances, there's always money.
Yeah,
I've seen
so
I've
true.
seen like companies about to go bankrupt, but oh, Cindy, she's amazing. We're gonna give her
It's
$300,000. Like,
so
what?
true.
Really? We can't even send a FedEx, and we're gonna pay her $300,000. So, but it's
So
true,
true.
right? People, and so when you know your value and you can prove your value,
Yeah,
it makes all the difference. So
absolutely.
what about, you talked about your significant other? How do you negotiate with a significant other?
Oh,
And obviously there could be so many things. Where are we going on? Where are we having for dinner? Where are we going on vacation? Your
yeah,
mother-in-law can't live with us. What kind of things do
yeah,
we think about that might be different than negotiating in the workplace, besides
yeah.
the fact that you are living with this person?
Yeah, I love that. And I get a lot of pushback around this, to be honest, especially because people are like, Cindy, I don't think of my relationship with my intimate partner as being a negotiation. I find that offensive, right? And again, I think it's that conditioning people have around the world. Lose the baggage around the word negotiation and just
Hmm.
think communication and relationship is obviously everything when you're talking about your intimate partner. So everything you can do to up level your skills to be able to be more open and receptive, to speak their love language, to be able to understand, get curious about those areas that could be potential conflict. So I guess and I alluded to it earlier, but it's really valuable in business. And I think it's particularly valuable as well in our intimate relationships or even our relationships with our kids for that matter. And that's that 5W, right? Don't wait. In our personal relationships, we tend to hold stuff in and hold stuff in, and then
Hmm.
something happens, and boom, the genie pops out of the bottle, and look out because there
I wouldn't know
hasn't been.
anything. I wouldn't know anything about that. So,
And we're all guilty, right? I mean, all guilty of it. But it's all of these pent up. There's been no forethought, no preparation. So the best advice I would give is any difficult conversation that you think you may have, any important conversation that you're going to have in your relationship with your intimate partner, prepare for it in the same way that you would a business meeting. So
hmm,
consider that 5W model. Who do I want to show up as? Who are they expecting me to show up as? Who are they likely to show up as? What's
right.
important to me? Is this thing we're going to discuss, how does that relate to the relationship outcome I need here? But also the where and the when. There are certain conversations that you want to have in the bedroom, and there are other conversations that should never be taking place in that sort of space, right? Some conversations you want to do when you're on a beach in Hawaii, and some maybe if you're over brunch. So be very, in real estate they say location, location, location.
Absolutely.
In books it's like setting, authors spend a lot of time on. Where you negotiate is pick an environment to have those discussions that will be most conducive to an open sharing of information. So the who, what, where, when. Pick your timing. Don't wait until it's the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl to be raising an issue, or be really strategic about when. As kids, we knew intuitively, don't ask our parents for something if they're in the bad mood. So to the extent
Right.
that you can, choose your timing. And the fifth is the why. Be really intentional about both yours and the other and your partner's deep whys about any of the issues you're talking about. Because we tend to bring so much baggage, we start clouding, and we stop seeing the person we fell in love with sometimes. So
Yeah.
remind yourself about the things that you love about the person, and it will so elevate your communication with your intimate partner, and you will get more of what you want. And not only more of what you want, but you'll get better outcomes, unexpected
Right.
outcomes on issues that you hadn't thought about.
Excellent advice. Now, you've written another book called Practice with Purpose, and you interviewed a bunch of thought leaders in the legal profession. You interviewed me as well. So, other than my interview,
Fabulous.
what are some of the key takeaways that you'd want to give? Because I know we have people from all over listening to this
Yes.
podcast, but probably a large number of lawyers and law students. What are some key takeaways from the book that you'd want to leave lawyers, law students, people who work with lawyers,
Yeah.
about how to practice with purpose? Because the profession, I think, now is at such a tipping
Oh,
point
yeah.
with just general malaise,
Yeah.
unhappiness. You're
Yeah.
hearing unhappy in-house counsel. They used to be the happy ones with the cushy
Yes.
jobs. I don't think the jobs are ever cushy, but that was the impression.
Yeah.
But now they're not even hiding that they're also stressed and burned out.
Yeah.
What do you recommend, or what are some takeaways from
Yeah.
the book? Of course, everybody should buy it.
Yes,
But
your insights are
but
brilliant.
and I do like the fact that you have these chapter takeaways. So if you're too lazy to read the actual interviews, you can just look at the takeaways. But
Well, it's the interesting thing to me was this project. I love this project because I thought it was so consistent with my beliefs around the art of feminine negotiation. This idea that we've been conditioned to see success on this more competitive model. And then it struck me, my gosh, our legal system is the worst offender. Like we even taught our language, even, right? It's the other side. It's about winning or losing. It's opposing counsel. All of our language comes from that win or lose. And I believe, people are leaving the practice in droves, in part because it's this fight or flight constant response at work every day. And it does and the irony is it does a disservice to the clients as well. So interviewing people who were very like-minded was such a gift to me, frankly, putting it together, because it gave me so much hope. Because the messages that I would love to share that I think were consistent throughout the book were: pick an area of the law that you love, that you're passionate about, right? Like, be really intentional about that. Don't be just looking for the money at first. The money will come when you do
do
something
what you
that you
love and the
really care
money will
about.
come. Do what you love and
Absolutely.
the money
So
will come. I tell students that all the time.
I totally agree. So find something you're passionate about and be willing to be creative and bring new approaches. Don't follow that traditional win-lose model. Really look at ways that you can better serve your client by finding what are the needs underneath the issue that we're dealing with here, and what are some maybe creative solutions we have. So bringing that art of curiosity to the table, that art of fascination, looking at different billing models, for example, so that you can show up, having mentors and sponsors, and building a network and a community of like-minded people. Surround yourself with people. It's that power of proximity. Try and
Right.
surround yourself with people who inspire and uplift you. It can profoundly change the practice of law. When you come to law, practice the law on your terms and be really intentional about that. I think that is the overriding message that I loved.
So that is fantastic advice. But now I'm going to ask you, what's the best advice that you received that you did not take? And
Oh,
how did that
gosh.
affect you?
Oh my gosh. Well, one, ironically, speaking of mentors and sponsors, it was something I had heard about very early. And I was very much, and maybe it's my background, I grew up in a sort of low rental apartment complex. We did not have a lot of money. There was a lot of baggage around, probably feeling less than in some ways.
Mhm.
Nobody in my extended family had ever gone to post-secondary school. So I was having to figure it all out on my own. I didn't know where to apply or how to do any of that. And that mindset carried on, much to my detriment, to be honest, right? When I look back, I hang my head in shame when I think of
Mm.
how much smoother the path could have been, how many more opportunities I could have had if I had not felt like I needed to do everything myself, be the lone wolf, that somehow getting help was a sign of weakness. So that I think is a strong piece. Look for allies, sponsors, and mentors. Know the difference between those three, and actively seek them out. So that is definitely a piece of advice I got and ignored to my detriment.
So for people who don't know the difference between ally, sponsor, and mentor, we all have our terms for it. How
Yeah.
would you describe it? And is one more important than the other, depending on your
Mm.
career trajectory or where you are in your development?
Oh gosh, God, have good questions. I tell you, very deep.
You've been on
Um,
eight, you have your own podcast. You've been on 8 million interviews. I have to come up with something different.
well, I tell you, you're setting the bar high. So this podcast is going to be a hit. These are brilliant questions. Um, I would say you've really got me stumped about, is one more important than the other? I think it depends. I think they're all important for different reasons. So the difference between a sponsor is somebody who is going to be advocating for you behind doors that you don't necessarily have access to, right? So
Mhm.
somebody who is at a higher, in a high position of authority and decision making within an organization, who is going to sponsor or advocate you behind closed doors. In other words, geesh, you know what? Why don't we look at so and so for this particular position? Or I think they'd be great for this training. So somebody
Right,
who is going to advocate for you behind closed doors. A mentor, and I advocate, frankly, get multiple mentors. Think of
right.
all of the skills that you're going to need to be really effective at your job, whether it's public speaking, networking, analytical skills. Find people that you admire who really do that, excel in each of those areas, and try and have a mentor in each different area so you can develop. So this is somebody that you're going to learn from model, up level your game by learning specific skills from from your mentors typically. And allies are people where, whether it's coworkers or either inside an organization or out, but people who are going to help support you on the journey. So one great example of that is, if you're in a boardroom and women's ideas tend to keep being taken by their male counterparts, or they get
Mm-hmm.
talked over in a meeting, you would have allies in advance who would go, "Oh, Joe, thanks for repeating Cindy's point on that. I'm really glad you amplified that for her," right? Or if you've got a particular issue where there's going to be controversy, build some allies in advance of getting into the meeting so that you know you're going to have some vocal support in the meeting. So that's a sort of shorthand version of the difference between allies, mentors, and sponsors, all of which are important, but for different reasons.
I love it. So I always like our listeners to be inspired or empowered or educated. What's a book or a song or a mantra or a movie or something that really affected your
Mm.
life that has had the ability to shape who you are today, for good or for ill?
Okay, that is a great question. There's so many, and I came late to it. I wish I had discovered personal development books earlier, to be honest. I came late to that party. I saw them as a little woo woo early in my life, and again, much to my detriment. I would say um, Think and Grow Rich was an interesting sort of perspective shift for me. I think that had me thinking differently about concepts that I thought I had wrapped my head around. And because
So
it covers
that's
sort of,
Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. So we'll put
yes,
that in the show notes. Hmm.
yeah, Napoleon Hill, absolutely sort of a game changer. Um, and I'm trying to think of movie. I'm a big movie
Oh,
fan.
you don't have to pick one for each.
Okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
So,
Well, then, yeah,
and
I would say Think and Grow Rich was the first one that came to mind for me. So I would, yeah.
right. And I don't know if you've read or heard on it the audiobook, the Outwitting the Devil by Napoleon
Yes,
Hill. I
I
think
did. I read that.
I actually prefer Think and Grow Rich, but I mean it's an interesting thing because many people have heard of that, but they haven't
Yes.
heard and basically Outwitting the Devil is really all about your mind and your subconscious being the thing that's trying to hold
Yeah.
you back. So
Yeah.
what is the biggest takeaway or action item you want the audience to leave with? You've left us with so many nuggets. Is there something I didn't ask that I should have asked that you think would be really helpful for the audience to know?
I would say, recognize one thing we didn't touch on that I would just raise is recognizing the profound potential negative impact of unconscious gender bias for both men
Yes.
and women, and to stop blaming and shaming. That the only
Hmm.
way we're going to affect meaningful change is if we recognize that when we talk about unconscious gender bias, this isn't just men against women, it's women against women, women against ourselves, it's
Yes.
men against other men, and vice versa. We both men and women suffer from unconscious gender bias. And the piece that most profoundly affected me, I think, was recognizing that our own performance is affected by unconscious gender biases. Like when they took young women writing their SAT exams and had half the control group identify their gender in advance of writing the test, simply check
Hmm.
off whether they're male or female, they actually performed more poorly. So,
Yes, I've seen
really
those
give the grace
studies.
and space to recognize that impact.
Excellent. And actually, the gender bias question was one of the first questions I'd planned to ask you, and then we kind of went off. So I'm so glad that we came back to that. So, how can people work with you? Of course, we're going to give all of your links in the show notes, but people who are listening while they're doing their laundry or driving their car, how
You
can
bet.
people work with you and get more in touch with you?
I'd say anybody who finds this concept interesting, go to artoffemininenegotiation.com. Got loads of free ebook. I talked about the 5W model. There's a no fear model. I've got free ebooks. I do blogs every week on everything from A to Z about negotiation. So loads of free resources. And also, if you want a breakthrough session with me, I'll offer a free breakthrough session. And the other thing I'll offer for your listeners, which normally you have to grab the book, but the Art of Feminine Negotiation book, if you go to artoffemininenegotiationbook.com, it's intended for people who've bought the book as an additional resource for them. But even if you haven't got the book, go to artoffemininenegotiationbook.com. Loads of, you'll get a workbook there, as well as some other practical resources that you can use to kickstart your journey to start up leveling your negotiations right out of the gate.
Excellent. And I love these books. And and whether you're male or female or however you identify, I don't want anybody getting thrown off by the title. This information is so valuable because we negotiate literally every day about everything we just don't know. And how much more effective could we be? And by the way, how much more peaceful the world could
Yes.
be if we learned how to negotiate
Oh,
without screaming, without feeling that we have
absolutely.
to win, that we have to one up each other. If we learned how to listen, how to do active listening, different kinds of levels of listening. So you
Mhm.
have such a tremendous service you're putting out to the world. And it's been such a joy to have you on here. Thanks so much, Cindy, for being with us.
Oh, thank you. I love everything you bring to the world. So thank you for all you do and bring.
Wonderful. And listen up for the next episode of Illuminating Wisdom. Thanks so much for joining us. Stay tuned for the next episode. If you like what you heard, subscribe and share it with others.